Hey everyone! Today I'm going to be simplifying the pour and scrape method by showing you a more accessible, easier alternative. If you're tired of battling molten wax with a hot palette knife in one hand while you're balancing your matrix in the other, or if you're frustrated by fine details disappearing as you do that final scrape to clean the surface, then hopefully you'll find this series helpful. My aim is to help you explore new ways of approaching wax sealing, understanding when certain methods are likely to be most useful, and support you in troubleshooting the problems that can arise along the way. Before we begin, I should say that this video is not going to be able to cover every possible aspect of this method or the techniques discussed, or all of the principles behind them, as it would be extremely long and quite difficult to follow. So this is going to form part of a broader educational series in which I break different aspects of wax sealing into smaller, more focused videos. To keep things as clear and as manageable as possible, this first series will focus on what I call the scrape method family, specifically those which involve the palette knife alone. For anyone new to wax sealing, the scrape family is a group of methods used for introducing multiple colours into a single seal. One of the most known methods within that family is the pour and scrape, where molten wax is applied top down to the face of the matrix, which is the stamp head, and the XX wax is then removed from the surface with a heated palette knife. There are, however, several other methods within the scrape family. I find it helpful to separate them by technique because although they all sit under the same broader umbrella, each one has its own strengths, limitations, and best uses. As this is the first video in the series, I'll be focusing on what I call the stamp and scrape method. I think it's a relatively simple and beginner-friendly place to start, and one which often lends itself to less mess and a higher chance of success. The stamp and scrape method is where the matrix itself spreads the wax into a very thin layer when stamped. Once set, the outer rim of displaced wax can be easily removed from the edge of the seal, leaving a very thin surface film of wax to be scraped away with the heated palette knife. The main advantage of this approach is that it allows the pressure of the stamp to do most of the heavy lifting. And if you're working with a low viscosity wax, which means that the wax is very fluid when it's molten, you have much more control over the final thickness of the seal. I also find this method useful in quite a wide range of situations. Compared with other scrape-based approaches, it tends to be cleaner, results in less waste, and for me, it feels like a safer option in terms of burn risks. So when do I reach for this method? I find it especially helpful for fine matrix designs, seals containing multiple detail styles, so fine and thick or deep and shallow, seals with multiple distinct layers, larger stamp faces that might otherwise become quite cumbersome. It's also helpful for conserving wax, both in waste and within the seal itself. So the things that you will need or find helpful for this method: your wax sealing spoons, wax sealing burner or furnace, wax sealing beads or sticks, tea lights, silicone scraper, artist palette knife, mug warmer or a hot plate, and finally a silicone mat or a silicone surface. Before we begin, there are questions you might want to ask yourself. What do I want my final seal to look like? How much detail does my stamp have? Are the details fine and delicate, or are all the details similar in size and depth? What's my chosen wax like? Is it thin, low viscosity like water? Or is it quite thick, high viscosity like honey? Does it set very quickly, or do I have some working time? Does my stamping surface give me time to work with my wax, or does it make the wax cool down faster? Now, let me walk you through the basic process of the stamp and scrape method. I start with my prepared workspace. I've made sure everything is nice and clean because any residue can interfere with adhesions, surface finish, and the quality of the scrape. My palette knives are resting to the side on my very battered mug warmer, getting nice and hot for later. You can see here I've chosen a stamp with a lot of different levels of detail, going from very fine lines to smaller recesses with some surface area, and finally a nice sizable centerpiece, which has a lot of fine details around the border still. These details on their own can be challenging, but combined together they can cause some trouble. I feel like it's a good stamp to demonstrate the flexibility of the stamp and scrape. Today I won't be heating my stamp. Whilst this can be a useful technique in the right circumstances, it's not always necessary, and the more factors we can control and anticipate, the more replicable our results can be. I'll be predominantly working on a silicone surface with this method, although I do finish on a marble surface. They both serve different purposes in this process. Next, I melt the wax until it's smooth and fluid. For this method, I prefer a relatively low viscosity wax, so it's thin and fast flowing, so that it spreads easily under pressure. This doesn't mean that higher viscosity or thicker waxes are inappropriate. It just might mean that you have to heat your thicker waxes for longer, or alternatively, just press harder. Once the wax is ready, I pour onto the silicone surface. I then bring the stamp straight down into the wax and press firmly. Silicone surfaces extend the cooling time of the wax as it helps the wax retain its heat. This gives me more time and flexibility with my stamping. On marble, glass or tile, the wax will immediately begin to cool and harden, which can result in a thicker seal, which isn't the outcome we want right now. I tend to press in micro stages to ensure maximum detail retention, the initial stamp down capturing the wax into the design, with the mini presses afterwards to sharpen the impressions. Then, I lift the stamp gently from the silicone, which is not necessary for the method. My reasoning is usually because it's easier to remove the border wax, and I'll be better able to show you how thin the seal is. The nice thing about this stage is that if I spot any bubbles or blemishes I don't want, it's quick enough to restart the process. I can now easily remove the excess wax, either cutting it away with a pair of scissors or peeling it off like I have here. This nicely separates the edge cleanup from the surface cleanup, which makes the process much more controlled and means I have much less wax to worry about. When working with finer detailed seals, I usually remove the seal from the matrix to check that every detail has been captured. In very fine features, the surface tension of the wax can bridge across narrow recesses, while trapped air can prevent the wax from fully filling them. Some laser engraved seals, like the one in this video, may also have steep sidewalls and a rough microtexture on the inside, both which can reduce flow to the smaller details. Here we have a successful capture. All the fine branches have been picked up clearly. I've returned my seal back into the cold matrix, ensuring it's nice and secure by giving a good hard press into the marble. This might be where you may consider heating your stamp very slightly if you find your seal isn't sitting flat or it's popping out. In finer or more delicate designs, like the seal I've chosen today, excess heat of the stamp face can keep the wax too soft and, if not controlled, can result in bleeding, and it risks you removing wax from areas that you wish for it to remain. It can also result in adhesion issues in fine or these textured areas. For that reason, I recommend for beginners especially to keep the matrices cool, or at least just a little bit warm, as in not freezing to touch. However, if you do choose to heat your matrix, remember to bear in mind that the more surface area there is on your matrix head, the less time it will take to heat. A few seconds for one stamp might be 20 seconds for another just to reach slightly warm. The stamp I have today has quite a large surface area, as there's a lot of metal that will directly touch the mug warmer. Now that I've checked my stamp is nice and secure in place, I take my hot palette knife to start scraping the remaining wax from the surface. This is the longest part of the process, and remember, you can take your time with this method as you have a lot more control over the variables. At this stage, the wax is fully cooled, it's consolidated, and it's sitting firm across the surface of the stamp. That means the first pass with a palette knife is usually not about removing a large amount of wax. More often, its main function is to begin to reintroducing heat to the surface wax, but minimizing heat to those deeper recesses. I'm using a fairly large and broad palette knife, so I have a good, even heat retention and distribution, but I also have the thinner end tip if I need for finer work. Depending on the matrix design and my end goals, I sometimes switch to a narrower or smaller blade after most of the wax has been removed, giving me further control and minimizing the risk of overheating my finer details. So on that first pass, I'm not expecting dramatic wax removal. I'm really using the heated palette knife to gently warm the superficial wax layer and bring it closer to a workable state. You may see only a very small amount come away at this point, and that's completely fine, it's normal. This is why I prefer to go slowly here. If you move too quickly, the blade does not have enough contact time to transfer heat into the surface wax and separate that thin film from the wax in the recess. In that situation, the knife starts to behave more like a blunt shearing edge, which increases drag and pulls at the wax, damaging the design and lifting it out altogether in some occasions. So the aim is to let the heat do most of the hard work for you. I want the blade to soften the surface wax just enough so it can be skimmed away with minimal force. Ideally, the knife is doing very little digging or pushing, but you still want to maintain this firm, even pressure as you scrape. This can be a bit of a difficult thing to balance. However, if you take your time to notice how the wax is behaving, you can adjust it as you go, and each pass should get easier. If the wax isn't sliding, maintain the pressure against the surface, holding the blade edge flat against the seal edges, but slow down on your movement. Don't push it forward. You'll feel the resistance lessen as you begin to feel the blade glide across the relief. For that reason, I treat scraping as an incremental process rather than a single decisive pass. I make one pass, clean off the excess wax on my silicone or paper towel, then I reheat the knife, assess the matrix, and then go again. By reheating the knife after each pass, I'm resetting my variables. I'm using the same consistent temperature. If I didn't do this, I'm not entirely sure what I have done that may have caused an issue further on. I also change direction as I scrape. Different areas of the design will respond differently depending on the orientation of the lines, the width of the engraved space, and the amount of wax that sits across them. By varying the direction, I can often reduce the risk of dragging material consistently in one direction across fine detail. There are times when you can see that you have removed just slightly too much wax, and a fine halo-like void begins to appear as an outline within the design. Sometimes this happens because too much material has been taken away in one direction, and other times a small section of wax may just have simply lifted. If you catch it early, try reversing the direction of your scrape. Very often, this will draw a small amount of the remaining excess wax back into the gap and refill it. This technique has saved many of my seals. Once I've done the main scraping with a hot palette knife, there can still be this very fine film of wax left on the surface that the hot blade just won't remove cleanly. Sometimes they can be difficult to see before stamping, so I'll lightly drag my fingernails across the matrix to check whether anything is still lifted away. In this example, you can see where that fine film remains, and you can see how it shows up in the final seal. A common technique here is to use a cold palette knife to scrape off that final film. The trade-off is that it needs a light hand, because a cold blade is much more likely to catch and lift delicate detail, especially shallow areas or parts of the design with a larger surface area. And that is even more likely if the wax is still warm, because it will tend to stick to the blade rather than release cleanly. My preferred way of getting rid of that last fine film is to buff it away gently with either my fingernails or a kitchen towel. I prefer using my fingernails because I get much more sensory feedback that way, so I can tell almost immediately if I'm starting to pull wax away from somewhere where I want it to stay. After that, I let the seal cool if needed. Depending on the design and also how long I've spent working on it, I'll often gently remove the wax from the matrix before going on to the final stamp. With finer designs, the wax can sometimes cling quite firmly in the recesses, and if that happens, part of the design may end up staying behind in the stamp, instead of transferring properly into the final seal. When I'm able to remove it, to then return it back to the matrix, I find I don't have this issue. With designs where that isn't ideal, I make sure that my final pour is hot enough to bond well with the wax still sitting in the matrix. But that also comes with a trade-off, because in very fine designs or with strongly pigmented waxes like reds or blacks, a hotter pour can increase the risk of bleeding. In this example, you can see where parts of the design were stuck in the matrix, and where some of the finer branches did not fully adhere to the green wax, which, as it happens, was a fast cooling wax. For my final pour, I typically use my marble surface, as it gives me a thicker stamp with nice high rounded borders. Today I'm working with a fairly fast cooling wax, so I make sure that I'm working quite quickly and that my wax is quite hot as I pour. And voila, the completed seal, with all the fine details captured and nothing lost. I hope you enjoyed this video and found it helpful. Please let me know in the comments if you have any questions or if you have any feedback or requests for future wax sealing videos. And in very cliche YouTuber fashion, please like and share. And if you're up for it, subscribe to my channel. Now that I've taken the plunge with this first long form video, I will definitely be posting more. And the fact that I just bought a mic specifically for this as my last audio was terrible, I'll have to do more. So thank you very much. Bye!